Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our worst map ever series by looking at Volokolamsk. To speed things up a bit, I am going to just refer to the map as Volo for the remainder of this video, so that's what I'm talking about whenever I say Volo. Additionally, I hope you can bear with the rather poor quality of the very first clip, but it is to demonstrate a point. The main version of Volokolamsk Volo is actually one of the largest maps in the game at around 4 kilometers square. There are some other maps that are around the same size, but there isn't any map that's just orders of magnitude larger, and you can see by the clip in the background, these are ground vehicle to ground vehicle kill shots in a normal match of the game of War Thunder, not a custom match, that are going out to 2,800 meters. These are the second and third longest range shots I have ever landed in this game. So I hope that helps you to appreciate exactly how big Volo is as a map, at least the larger version. This also neatly segues, however, into a fairly minor discussion that I want to have with you guys about the worst map ever series and some of the difficulties involved in actually completing this series. Now, obviously I did change my recording methods earlier this year, so I do have some footage of some of these maps, but the quality is so poor that unless it's something really exceptional like the footage in the background that really shows off part of the map, I really don't want to use it. On top of that, the other main issue is that the newer and improved recording quality also has a higher storage space requirement. So when you have about 50 or so maps that you have in War Thunder, and I'm just collecting the maps as I go, you end up with a very prohibitive logistical constraint on doing a ton of footage for any one individual map. So while one of the critiques in the previous video is that I should show off specific positions, I hope you understand that it is kind of logistically impractical for me to store enough footage over a long enough period of time for all of the maps in order to really achieve that. Believe me, I would love to if I had the capability to do so, but the only real option would be to go into custom matches, and if I'm going into a custom match and I'm not showing you specifically why it's good in a live match against other players, I'm not ultimately convinced that's that much better than simply highlighting it on the mini-map and explaining to you what you can use it for, but that's just my opinion on the matter. On top of that, while you have Big Volo that only has 2 variants, Small Volo has a total of 5 variants, and this is another issue that we're running into because out of the 5 variants of Volo, there are actually 4 almost completely different maps. The basics of the terrain is the same, but the maps themselves are in different parts of Big Volo. And of course, this highlights another interesting logistical problem with doing the worst map ever series, is that Big Volo is only available at 9.7 and above, and Small Volo ends at 6.7. So I basically have to hunt for footage of maps like this at 2 completely different battle ratings, and there are around 50 maps total in the game, and I generally need a decent enough map that I can talk over it, so this usually involves about 3 different matches, and trying to get about 2 to 3 different matches depending on the length of the match for a specific map at a specific time is entirely up to the inevitable machinations of fate. I know somebody's been asking for Pradesh for a while. I would love to do Pradesh, but I'm just not pulling it in terms of the RNG for the matchmaker, and there's nothing really I can do to force pulling that match in my matchmaker. Going back to Volo itself, and Volo does have a rather interesting history in the game of War Thunder in that it currently has the record for the map that has been removed from the game the longest while still being added back in later. If White Rock Fortress ever comes back, it'll probably beat Volo's record, but by the time Volo was re-added to the game after it was reworked, so many players hadn't played it before that some members of the community actually thought it was a brand new map. So that's how long this map spent out of rotation, and part of the reason why it spent so long out of rotation is that the entire map is snow, and a long time ago the snow modifiers used to be terrible, so it was pretty awful to get anywhere on this map. The snow modifiers right now aren't all that good, but they were heavily reworked when all of the snow variants of maps like Poland and Ardennes were added, just to make sure those maps aren't a slog, and it did make Volo a little more playable. Now, while there are a total of 5 different variants of Small Volo, one of them I run into all the time, and the other 4 I basically never see regardless of what battle rating I'm playing at. So I have played on those variants of the map, but I get them so inconsistently that getting any kind of reasonable footage for them is borderline impossible, so I'm just going to breeze through them real quick in terms of my overall thoughts on how you should play them. For the 2-cap variant of Small Volo, I did actually notice that for this particular version, it is pretty viable to capture the opponent opponent's capture point, and a lot of this comes down to both of the capture points are in a bit of a depression and have some hard cover around them. So what this means is that it is actually possible to get on these points and capture them, while the enemy will actually struggle to contest them, because it's hard to tell from this map, but the actual terrain means they have to go up and down hills just to get into the point, and the best way to do so is along the roads, which themselves are basically channels that will funnel you into the enemy's line of fire. So while I still don't think you should necessarily go for that capture point right away, it is actually a viable strategy on this particular map. One thing I will say is that the forests to the south and to the north make for excellent sniping and flanking positions. Because the village itself in the middle of the map is in something of a depression, it does actually get left alone quite a bit. There are definitely some forests surrounding the village, however these are at best what I would call soft flanks, and that they're close enough to the fighting that you're not necessarily getting shot in the back. The enemies can be seen and can often be heard by vehicles in the town, so they aren't as much of an annoyance as the far flanks that you have on some of the other areas of the map. Overall, I think the best strategy is actually just securing the south of the map and the north of the map. Basically just surround the village, and then once you're done encircling it, then you basically close the noose, because in my opinion, trying to go straight up the middle of the village involves a lot of very narrow passageways and isn't always that easy. With that being said, if you do have a heavy tank like a Tiger or a KV-1, you can definitely roll up the middle of the map, and because you can limit the line of sight on the flanks pretty efficiently, being able to simply outbrawl your opponent in the middle can sometimes create the space your opponent needs. However, that is a vehicle-specific strategy, as not a lot of vehicles have the armor to really make that work. The next version of Small Volo is exactly the same as the one we just talked about, except it is zoomed in a fair bit, so the flanking opportunities from the south of the map are not as viable. On top of that, because the city is the one and only capture point, the play of just taking a heavy tank straight up the middle and trying to avoid the line of sights from the flanks is actually remarkably viable on this particular version of Volo. So basically, copy and paste everything I said previously, but put a much higher emphasis on taking something with heavy armor to just brawl in the middle of the city, because of how you can restrict the line of sight from the flanks. The next variant of Small Volo, and this is probably one of my least favorite, this is the variant that centers around the main church. The church is the only capture point on the map, and the big issue is that the south spawn has a fairly considerable advantage over the north spawn. The north spawn is in a bit of a depression and is very easy to flank, especially if you wrap all the way around the left and north side of the map. You can get a very good position that it's kind of hard for them to do anything about. Essentially, the north spawn has to dedicate a lot of their attention to flanking, not necessarily to win the map, but just to keep them from getting completely stuffed in spawn and cut off from the objective. Whereas conversely, the south spawn is a lot harder to spawn stuff just because of the way the terrain in and around its immediate spawn works out. It has a lot more opportunities to get out of its spawn without necessarily exposing itself to as much hostile fire. Yet again, the village is in a bit of a depression, but this time the forest on the north side of the map is actually a pretty effective flanking route to shoot into it. So if you can control the forest on the north side of the map or the hill to the south and right side of the map, you can actually do a lot of work in terms of shutting down enemies in the village itself. And the last version of Small Volo we're going to discuss before going more in depth into the map itself is going to be the train/trench line variant. This has a large train track running along the right hand side of the map and also going a little bit to the south. You obviously will be pretty familiar with this if you're familiar with the large version of Volo. Additionally, you also have some trench lines in and around the A capture point. In my humble opinion, the north spawn has a very substantial advantage on this particular map because the north spawn can get to the trench lines and get hard cover easier and can get up to the capture point while being contested harder. On top of that, the flanking routes to the forest to the immediate left hand side of the north spawn are actually incredibly effective at shutting down the south spawn entirely, and north spawn even has some good flanking routes to the south with the forest and train tracks. So north spawn has a very easy position to basically pincer and shut down south spawn, and there's not really that much south spawn can do other than trying to basically flank right to the north right away or try to get to the other side of the train tracks before the enemy gets set up and wrap all the way around. In essence, South Spawn is limited to a very handful of strategies unless you just have tanks with so much frontal armor that the enemy struggles to keep you from pushing on the objective. Now, moving on to the version of Volo that you're going to see the most often at low tiers, and this is the standard 3-cap small Volo. On the left hand side you do have a village with some buildings. This does provide at least some level of cover, however you are very exposed to flanks from the right, and honestly there's a lot of different positions that people can use to shoot into the town. So it's not the most secure position to try and take unless you have pretty good control over the immediate area, but that being said, it's usually one of the least fought for positions in the map, whereas the center tends to be a lot more heavily contested. When you go into the center of the map, you get B Point, which is also on, it's not really a village, it's more of a very small cluster of buildings. The biggest thing with the B Point that I would say is from the left, you're pretty well shielded from incoming fire by a forest, but from the right, enemies on the C Point have pretty good line of sight onto the B cap and can easily rush and take you out with no problem. So the biggest thing when you're taking the B cap is that while you will be getting shot down on from some of the hills from the immediate north and south, you do have to be acutely aware that the C cap does have a pretty efficient line of sight to take you out from a pretty decent distance. The C cap itself is another small cluster of buildings, and I wouldn't say it's the best protected cap, but it is the cap that people tend to go to the least out of all the areas on the map. You usually won't find yourself contested by more than 1 to 2 opponents in the opening phases of the map, and while you will have some opponents approaching you, you can use the third-person camera and the elevation to see where they're coming from a very long distance away. So in general, it is not that difficult to rush to the C cap early and secure it, and then once you have secured it, to maintain control of it. Specifically the South Spawn, because the South Spawn has convenient roads going to C cap, it actually has a more efficient route to get there and to take over it, and I do find in general this does give the South Spawn a bit of an edge on this map. The movement lanes on this particular part of Volo are actually somewhat weird because the area between B and C sees very little activity because it is in such a depression and is so exposed to all fires, whereas the area between A and B sees very heavy activity in general, and you should definitely be expected to be in for a fight if you're going to that part of the map. With that being said, I would say the map lacks clearly defined movement lanes for the most part. The closest you would really get is the obvious road going into A, but most of the other roads are not that advisable to follow because they're often in depressions and very easy to ambush. While both sides do prominently feature power positions on the left-hand side of maps, basically overlooking the gap between A and B, and you have to be aware of it because a lot of opponents will be peeking out from this area. The real power position on this map honestly is the C point. Controlling the C point is very important because it gives you so much control over the B point and over basically half the map that if you can control it for the majority of your time on Volo, you will be pretty successful. The problem is, even if you control the C point, more often than not your teammates are going A and B, so it's very common for you to exercise really strong control over C and then realize that your entire team has just died and gotten stuffed into spawn. So that is the one flaw with controlling C, and that while it is a dominant position, it's not quite dominant enough given how lemming-like behavior your team can sometimes have. If you do find yourself in a heavy tank or a vehicle with considerable armor, I would say the area between A or B probably suits you the best. It's the least amount of driving, at least along empty roads, so it doesn't expose you to hostile fire as much as the trip to C point can, and on top of that, you can control the lines of sight to you pretty easily with all the hills and narrow alleys. If you are playing something like a tank destroyer, however, all of the various hills around basically the entire map provide an excellent opportunity to use gun depression or frontal armor to its utmost. If you are playing a very fast and light vehicle, however, rushing to C is usually what you're going to want to do because this will give you the highest value. But even if you don't see the opportunity to rush to C, especially because if it is later in the map, it's likely somebody already controls it or those sightlines are already being watched, then going in between the area between A and B provides you a lot of opportunity to get effective flanks off on key objectives. Moving on to Big Volo, and the first thing we're going to discuss is the 2-cap variant, as is tradition, and honestly, one thing I will say about the 2-cap of Big Volo, it is incredibly easy to capture both of these capture points, and the big reason for that is both of them are in a fairly depressed part of the map, so you have a lot of cover around you, but on top of that, both of them are really far away from the enemy spawn. If you do catch it, apply pressure, and take out the handful of enemies around it, it's going to be a pretty tall ask for the enemy to push back onto either of these spawn points. This is what makes Big Volo one of the weirdest 2-cap maps in the entire game, because you can see both of the capture points are basically mid-map, and that means that it's actually entirely viable for one team to simply capture one of these points out from under the other team, because it takes so much work and there's so much driving involved in getting back to and retaking one of these points. I would still start any 2-cap map, and Volo is no exception, with an eye towards attrition and whittling down the enemy team, but if you do manage to successfully push the entire enemy team out of the area around their capture point, then it is basically fair game. As for the main variant of Big Volo, the 3-cap variant, the A-cap is the church that we've already seen from the smaller maps, and the church capture point is pretty easy to get onto and off of for both teams. It's just a question of can you get there before the enemy is actively fighting you for it. And this is one of the big things that I found with Big Volo in particular, is a lot of times people will seek to flank the A point to a pretty excessive degree, so quite often you're not that hotly contested if you just go straight to the A point, especially if you're on the right hand side, because the right hand side has a road right in their spawn that goes straight into the A point, so they can get there very quickly compared to the left hand side. Once you successfully capture the A point, and honestly the church makes pretty good cover to do so, there are a lot of opportunities to push out either north and try to wrap around into the enemy spawn, south to try to go to one of the other capture points, or just straight left and right. Honestly, with how many different directions you can go and how much access to the map you get from A, I think this is one of the better places that you can essentially start with a map on Volo, because if you successfully secure it and start pushing out, you're setting yourself up for a fair amount of success. The B point, however, is considerably more dodgy. While the point itself does provide a fair bit of cover, it is also much closer to the left hand side to the right hand side, at least in terms of raw driving distance. However, the B side is essentially surrounded by empty terrain on all sides, so it is very easy once you capture it to simply get sniped and have the enemy recapture it. This is the core issue that you'll often run into on Big Volo maps, is how easy it is to simply flip the B point by just waiting for whatever poor idiot captured it to leave, shoot them in the back of the head, and then retake it yourself. I've seen this happen multiple times in the course of a single map, and it is kind of funny, but it also highlights that B is one of the harder capture points out of this group to actually get out of. The C capture point is much more easily contested by the left-hand spawn than it is the right-hand spawn. They have a more direct route. They can actually just follow the train tracks for the majority of it, and as long as they get off the train tracks at the right time, they won't really be that exposed to hostile fire. On top of that, in this particular image, it looks like the C cap is a lot further north off of the train tracks, but in reality, in the actual game, it's directly centered on them, so you can simply capture it from the other side of the train tracks where the enemy can't really shoot you at all. This does raise an awkward point for the left-hand spawn though, because the right-hand spawn's helipad is very close to the C point, and a lot of times an early helicopter rocket rush will specifically hit anybody going for C. So you always want to keep an eye out for that helipad, because that is going to be your #1 problem capturing the C point. Once you capture the C point, because you have the convenient raised area of the railroad tracks as a bit of cover that you can peek over to try and see if enemies are looking for you, you have pretty good access to go basically wherever you want, to the left or right, and then try to move up into the map to either spawn stuff or go towards B. Overall, C is not a bad place to start, but it can feel a little on the exposed side, especially because no matter what you do, you always have a fair bit of open ground between the C cap and the tree line. Now, this is normally where we would segue into discussing the power positions on Big Volo. However, the more I play Big Volo, the more I realize it doesn't really have power positions. The problem is no part of the map is dramatically more elevated than the rest. As you saw by the initial clip, you can see almost across the entire map. So especially if you're at battle ratings with laser rangefinders, any vehicle can just get absolutely plastered from directions that they have basically no way of predicting. So in Volo, there isn't really any one power position that is hard to contest, and there are a lot of power positions that have substantial line of sight over the entire map. And because the map is also filled with a bunch of roads and railways that have different elevations and depressions, there's a lot of routes where you can use to basically sneak under the enemy line of sight, then pop up, take some shots, and then pop back. It's a very efficient strategy once you get the hang of it, and essentially once you get an idea and a good feel for the map flow of Volo, you you can use basically any of these raised positions as power positions at any given moment, because it's very difficult for an opponent to watch all of the potential avenues they can get shot from, just given the sheer volume of them available. As far as how to play Big Volo, one of the big things you're going to realize with basically all variants of Volo, but it shows up especially on Big Volo because A, it is a massive map, and also B, you're at a high enough battle rating that cast becomes relevant. Big Volo has very little cover from incoming planes. You have some forests that you can kind of use, you have some buildings on some capture points you can kind of use, but generally speaking, if a plane knows where you are and wants to hunt you down, they can take you out. This also leads into pretty neatly my biggest piece of advice about Big Volo, and that is you usually want to keep moving. I know it seems counterintuitive because the map is massive and there's a lot of driving involved. Staying in one area for an extended period of time is just asking for somebody to drive up and peek an angle that you didn't think even existed, or to just get slammed by a missile from orbit. In general, what you want to do with Volo is you want to go from capture point to capture point, or getting around the enemy's main front lines and start popping up, taking shots, popping back, going to a different position, rinsing and repeating. The map is really all about just trying to read the general flow and vibes of both teams and trying to maintain a good mix of moving in these depressions where nobody can really see you, and then popping up to take shots, and then moving to the next position. It's not really about staying in one spot the entire map, just because of how easy it is to counter a specific position either from the air or from the ground. In that respect, while the MBTs obviously excel at this sort of playstyle because most of the MBTs you're going to get at the battle ratings where you can get Big Volo are pretty good at just keeping mobile at all times, the only other class of vehicles that I find really excels on Big Volo are actually the wheeled tank destroyers that use missiles, things like the Mephisto or the Afti, because you can easily drive into a position that somebody wasn't expecting, pop some shots, get some kills, and then drive to the next position. These vehicles' high mobility, combined with the fact that they can use all the various hills and roads to their advantage, actually does allow them to perform pretty well. On top of that, because the map is so big and there are so many depressions where you can potentially hide things, anti-aircraft systems also tend to be a lot less vulnerable to hostile air and hostile ground forces on this specific map. It's really a combination of the fact that it's not just that the map is big that allows you to hide the anti-aircraft systems, it's that the map is big, but it also has quite a few depressions, and there are just in general a bunch of places that are in and around and behind the spawn that you can potentially be that an aircraft might not notice. Obviously, if you just sit in spawn, you will be a pretty easy target for most aircraft, but if you at least make an effort to move around and try to get into unexpected locations, the map does have a lot of those to offer that you can exploit. With that being said, Volo is an incredibly painful map if you don't have laser rangefinders or thermals, and especially if you're at battle ratings where most of your opponents do. Being able to spot opponents at long distances and being able to hit opponents at long distances is absolutely vital to having good games on Volo, and Volo can appear all the way down to 9.7, so you can definitely have some vehicles that will struggle at identifying or hitting targets. And that is doubly true if the vehicle is in fact stock. In fact, stock vehicles, especially if you're running something like Heat FS, tend to really struggle on Volo because Heat FS requires precise shots, and if the enemy is 2,800 meters away, you're probably not landing that precise shot. In this respect, I find Big Volo is a bit of a paradox because while it does let a bunch of fully upgraded top tier MBTs stretch their legs a little, it also really punishes you if you're not a fully upgraded MBT. As far as my overall thoughts on the Volo maps in general, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Volo because on the one hand it is the king of getting shot from angles that you didn't think somebody had, and it is also the king of getting absolutely smashed by planes and helicopters because there's basically nowhere to hide from them. On the other hand, it is also the king of getting those really annoying flanks off because the map is so big that unless the enemy team is communicating incredibly well, it's going to be very hard for them to communicate quickly and effectively where they're getting shot from. So if you do pull off those crazy flanks, they often pay off in spades, way more than any other map, just because of how big it is and how many different places you could potentially be. In a lot of other maps, when one of your teammate dies, you can usually make at least some sort of reasonable conclusion about where they got shot from, but in any given position on Volo, unless you're talking in the middle of one of the cities, they could have literally been shot from basically the entire map. So this allows really efficient flanking opportunities where you can get in and behind the enemy team way better than you can with a lot of contemporary maps, just because of how goofy the lines of sight are and how big the map is. On top of that, as I've kind of said in the past, I do generally prefer snow maps just because the visibility both for enemy vehicles and enemy aircraft is a lot better on snow maps. It reduces the power level of things like bushes, it allows anti-air to be more effective, etc, etc. That's just a personal preference thing. I find snow maps in general, for me, are just more interesting to play than maps where it feels like you're basically playing Where's Waldo to try and figure out which of the brown specks on the horizon is actually an enemy vehicle. Volo also has another interesting characteristic, and it shares this with some of the other big maps like Red Desert, in that a lot of times if people die the first time, they either don't respawn or they just respawn in an aircraft, even if it's not a particularly good one. This means that in Volo, the teams tend to thin out very quickly. Usually in the first few minutes of the map, you're already down several players of people who have either quit right away when they saw it as a big map and don't like it, or they died and just didn't want to respawn and go for another driving simulator, or they died, got in a plane, and then immediately got shot down by an anti-aircraft system because they didn't spawn a very good plane. So big Volo in general does tend to thin out the teams very quickly and make the game a lot more manageable. And this is another thing I've noticed with War Thunder in general, is a lot of the maps play considerably better when the teams are only about half of their normal size. This is something you'll run into a fair bit if you do play night maps, because night maps not everybody has disabled, so when they come up, often you'll get smaller teams, and those smaller teams often result in my humble opinion, better experiences. Volo kind of does that naturally and accidentally because the map is so large that the odds of you getting more than a handful of enemies in one space at one time is low, but then it also naturally attrits players who simply don't want to go driving for another 30 seconds to a minute. Unfortunately, you can also be on the receiving end where you get dropped pretty early in the map and now you're confronted with the prospect of having to drive all the way back to where you previously were, which again could have been anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute of driving across open snow, which is not particularly fun. But again, this is why I also have this love-hate relationship with Volo. It's like rolling a d20. Sometimes you roll 1 and you just get smashed right out of spawn and you're debating whether or not you even want to stay in the map, and other times you get off a really effective flank and wipe out the entire enemy team. If the games in general were a little more even-keeled, I would probably have a more positive overall outlook, but as it stands right now, I don't love it, I don't hate it. I've had some good games in it, but I've also just had some terrible games in it too. While the small variants of Volo don't often devolve into driving simulators, they also kind of have their own issues in that it can often be somewhat difficult to push back on a point that you previously controlled just because of all the elevations that can potentially overwatch that point by using the third-person camera to just peek over a hill, and then as soon as you're not paying attention, they pop over the kill, shoot you, and kill you, and that's not going to be very fun trying to rush back into that. But on the other hand, if you're the one doing that to other people, again, it is pretty fun. So that's one of the reasons why Volo for me sits in this weird area where sometimes I absolutely love playing it and sometimes I just want to quit as soon as it comes up. But those are just my thoughts on the matter. Feel free to let me know what you think about Volokolamsk in the comments down below. Do you love it? Do you hate it? I always love to hear from you guys. If you like the video or found it entertaining, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.